Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Mallory Treadway and I am a marketing coordinator at Keller Schrader. And today I'll be your moderator. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A section. And it is my pleasure to introduce your presenter today, Josh Pack. Josh is a practice leader for strategic management and data science. He is a part of our data strategy group, which partners with organizations to develop their analytics initiatives and capabilities from both a strategic planning perspective, as well as designing and implementing data analytics platforms and solutions. Josh has 20 years of experience in roles ranging from operations analysis and data science to strategic planning and business development. He's worked in multiple sectors, including energy and utilities, financial services, process industries, and management consulting. Josh holds a PhD in bio and environmental engineering from Cornell University, where he researched operations research models applied to biofuels production and supply chains. And now I'm going to send it to Josh.
All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate it. Got a little echo here, but we'll take care of that. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So again, thanks, Mallory. Really appreciate the introduction. And thank you everyone for your time today. I'm going to keep this relatively brief, but we hope that you get a lot out of it. We hope you find it enjoyable and informative. I'm going to dive right in here. So this is a little slide to talk about the motivation for my talk today. So this may seem a little familiar to some of you out there, maybe a lot of you. You know, imagine a board of directors saying, why aren't we doing AI? And then that's usually directed at the CEO, and that individual will say, you know, to the rest of the organization, we need to be doing AI. And really it's up to the organization to figure out what that means and why, and then present a strategy back to the CEO. So, but the problem here, the complication, is that IT is generally going to be doing kind of run the business type activity day in and day out, and that's going to be a constraining factor on figuring out how to attack this problem. Usually it's not the highest priority, and they're going to let folks know that we'd like to be helping you, but you know, our hands are kind of tied just doing what we have now. We're not really budgeted for that, and so it becomes a challenge. Meanwhile, operations is often saying something like, you know, we're drowning in our own data, but we don't have any good information. Can somebody please help us? We really are not able to solve all these challenges on our own. We're trying to keep the business running and growing. And then maybe outside the organization, you know, folks that want to get into data science. Maybe there's some junior talent that admires your company and wants to get in there. And, you know, honestly, in today's market, maybe instead of, do you have any openings for data scientists, you're also getting questions like, what do you pay data scientists, just because of the availability of that highly sought after skill set. And then finally, the CFO, once they hear about it, they're going to say, okay, well, what's the value and how much will this cost? What's our plan? And so presumably all of you on the line today are champions within your organization. We're going to assume that for analytics and data management. And so this really gives rise to the need for a solid foundational data strategy to help sort of lasso all of these questions and constraints in order to do the best with constrained resources in this ultra important area of data science, data innovation, data strategy, and analytics. So at Keller Schrader, we have a team called the Data Strategy Group, of which I am a part. And we've published this data strategy framework, which is really a cultural journey on how to launch or sustain or improve your analytics organizations in your companies today. So just a quick overview of all this, you know, the exploratory phase, regardless of how mature you are or your size or where you stand, the exploratory phase is a matter of taking stock of what you have, and then also doing an external view of what's going on in your industry, what can we learn from that, and then trying to really solidify and crystallize a data strategy from which you can operate. And then that gives you sort of the table stakes to justify a broader investment phase, which is to say, let's do a true business case with all the financials and ROI justification and a plan for how to carry this forward and add value to the company. That's the investment phase. That's not the subject of our talk today, but it's the ultra critical next step after today's talk. And then the subsequent phases include the architecture phase, which is not so much about technology platforms, although it does include that. When we say architecture, we're really talking about your organizational structures and processes and sort of think of it as the internal brand architecture as well for analytics and incorporating all those aspects. What is the structure and the setup for being successful with analytics? And then, of course, procurement and implementation. Those are exactly what they sound like, although when we get to those future talks, we'll give you some tips and pointers on how to do that all really well. And then finally, in the execution phase, we're talking about now that you've invested and built all this capability, you've reorganized as needed. Now you're going to be, putting your money where your mouth is and actually delivering on the value and the promise of your strategy. And an important part of that is a good realization of benefit process. And again, that's a subject of a future talk. So I said a minute ago that I presume that you are all champions for your respective organizations when it comes to getting analytics and data management and data science off the ground. So if you don't mind, Mallory is going to send out this super brief survey for you all. Just two simple questions. How large would you say your organization is? And where would you put yourself on the maturity curve for analytics and data management? So very simple. And then towards the end of the talk, we will come back and see what the poll says. And please enter your name and info if you would like. We haven't made that a required field, but we'd love to be able to sort of analyze that and when we get back in touch after this point. So thank you for that. As I said, we're about the exploratory phase today. So let me just dive into what we describe as data strategy phase 0. Think of it as ground zero, the exploratory phase. And these are kind of the major steps within that. Internal assessment, which then proceeds to self-education, which, as I said, is kind of an external outlook. And then strategy positioning based on what you've learned. And then that leads to an important approval discussion to move into the next phase of investment, where you will develop a full-on business case complete with ROI on financials. And so the major output of all of this in the exploratory phase is that your team and your sponsors and executives have adopted a defined data strategy. And that's so helpful because then you've got everyone marching from the same sheet of music there. So the internal assessment, there are several steps within that. First and foremost, this is ultra critical, and you hear us say this a lot. You want to identify your sponsors, the ones who are going to kind of stay with you through a number of budget cycles when competing priorities tend to raise their heads in order to really reinforce the message and to support and enforce the behaviors required to bring about an analytics function. And of course, you'll want this person to be a logical and appropriate person that will have your best interests at heart, also in terms of funding. So that's really important. And you're not necessarily getting the firm commitment at this stage, but you've got a pretty good indication and feel for that person or small number of persons that will ultimately fund and support this culturally. So then from there, you probably have already identified some other champions such as yourselves. These are folks that are like-minded in terms of their views on needing to bring about change and improving on analytics that you may already have. They're going to be folks that will gladly and passionately contribute to the effort, and they're probably going to have just enough bandwidth at this point to really have those important conversations in identifying the next steps, which are to talk to executives. So at this point, you're really just kind of getting a pulse, understanding executive priorities. When you say analytics to them, what does that mean? What does that look like? They will probably immediately have ideas on where they would like to leverage data better inside the organization. And then, to underscore that, it's very important to align to corporate strategy. So even though execs might have kind of like their wish list or pet peeves or what have you, ultimately the things that they're going to be able to sort of politically and culturally support are the things that align to corporate strategy. And we really like to say that data strategy is corporate strategy. It's a natural extension and enablement of your corporate strategies. So seek executive perspective. Again, not looking for commitments, not asking for anything, just seeking to understand. So then from there, you want to go about the work of assessing your internal and current data capabilities. So, and I'm not talking about analysis here. We'll get to that in a second. I'm really talking about how is data managed inside your organization? How is it stored? How is it accessed? What are sort of the usage patterns of data? And similarly, what are the pain points? You know, I'm sure most of you are familiar with some of the maybe complaints and squeaky wheels inside the organization in terms of being able to bring data together to actually use it for something or to gain insights or to make decisions. So, you know, how is data managed? Begin to understand that. And we'll introduce the term data lifecycle here in a little bit as well. So it's really about the supply chain of data. What's your capability there? And then, of course, what are the analytics efforts, or I'll use the phrase use cases, many of you know that. What are you doing right now? You know, what are some of those things that are going well or that people have been trying for a long time that maybe have some impediments? You know, what analytics are present in your organization now? And, you know, the other side of that coin is who's doing it. So assessing the talent. And this isn't really about screening people or testing them on aptitudes or anything like that. It's really just attempting to understand who and how many and in what departments, and maybe just a high level understanding of their level of skills. You know, do they know stats? Have they taken engineering classes? You know, are they a business analyst or a statistician? Just kind of high level understanding in broad strokes of what is the talent level. Okay, so those are the main steps inside internal assessment. So going in a little deeper on this, just to kind of drive it home and give you some examples, when you're done with this step of internal assessment, these are the artifacts or deliverables that you want to have. Okay, so you want to have kind of a written record of your conversations, of course informal, but you know, kind of an inventory of strategic priorities for analytics that you got from your executive perspective conversations. You also want to have an inventory of the analytics already happening in the beginnings of what may become your use case backlog or use case portfolio or analytics portfolio. It's really just a simple list, as simple as having a list in Excel with a couple of columns just so you can get your bearings on everything you've learned. Simple as that. And then you also want to have a similar kind of high level running tab of the pain points that you've become aware of as you talk to champions, executives, sponsors, and other stakeholders. So these are some of the things you want to have in hand. And I'll just kind of, just to go another level of granularity, just to kind of solidify this even further, here's some examples. So in strategic priorities for analytics, you know, if you're a construction company or manufacturing or engineering firm, maybe you say something like, you know, we stake our reputation on operational excellence, so we need better data and reporting on this. Okay, so that's a nice sort of strategic statement that you might hear from a VP of construction or a chief operating officer, something along those lines. And then this will probably resonate with everybody with the Great Resignation being upon us. Employee retention and engagement is a huge issue. We need to implement people analytics quickly. And I won't get into people analytics, but it is what it sounds like. You know, being able to assess what are the pockets of potential flight of good people. Also very strategic. So, and then another sort of operational, but separate but related strategy conversation would be we want to continue to be a top quartile safety organization. So we need to use our data better in this area. Okay, so those are all kind of like strategic, informal strategic feedback that you might get from high-level leaders. In the inventory of analytics, these would be your use cases or running tab of things going on. So something like, we have a monthly production report prepared by sales. Okay, that's great. A lot of organizations have something like that. So write it down. You can take credit for that. And then similarly, maybe a little bit more sophisticated, is the quality department publishes the daily process control statistics dashboard. So obviously a manufacturing or production oriented type of use case, but also pretty straightforward to understand. Maybe that gets a little more sophisticated in terms of statistics, but it's still a pretty sort of entry level type of analytics item. And then here's something a little more fancy, and I'll pick on the utility industry and heavy industry. Our boiler control system uses proprietary efficiency algorithms, but we aren't using them effectively. Okay, so for those of you that are kind of in control rooms or familiar with SCADA systems or what have you, your software may have embedded algorithms that you may have limited knowledge of. So that is something that you could put on the list, but it's also an opportunity area. Anyway, so those are examples of an inventory of analytics, examples of pain points. And I know that this is something that may still plague organizations, even if you've moved on from paper, just application processes and intake processes. So our customer application process still involves way too many paper forms. Data entry is labor intensive and error prone. Okay, that is a data management pain point. It's probably the most basic there is, but it's still very prevalent. Another one, I can't get production floor data fast enough to troubleshoot developing issues. It's always a shift late, which doesn't help. And, this is, I decided to include this one based on a recent client conversation. And then similarly, and actually this is also probably a very broadly applicable to just about any industry. We've got lots of business analysts out there, and a lot of them will say something like, we have to pull from so many different systems. No wonder our reports never match. Okay, so errors and checking and all the labor of data quality comes into play here when you're building spreadsheets that come from lots of sort of manual downloads and so on. Okay, so these are all just examples. I wanted to make sure that you had sort of a frame of reference that would resonate with you as we move forward. So those are the examples for internal assessment, and just some important points of wisdom as you think about this step at this early stage in exploratory. You got to ask yourself, if we don't know why we're doing this, why would anybody fund it? Okay, so that points to the need for really crystallizing a strategy. If we can't explain it in terms of value to the organization, why would anyone fund it? So same idea, just maybe a little more quantitative. What are we going to get out of this? And then similarly on the value side, you need to start thinking about where in the organization could we be generating savings in terms of use cases. Similarly, where could we advance our understanding? Maybe there are processes that we only really understand slightly, or opportunities to better leverage our data in the marketplace. So where could we advance our understanding by leveraging our data and external data? Where are there pockets of this going on already in the company? That's just another way of describing the inventory of analytics, but this also gives it a twist in terms of, which departments. Maybe there are certain departments who have high skills versus others, and you want to learn from them, maybe benchmark around them a little bit and share those successes and put them on kind of as poster children. Where could we reduce regulatory headaches? And you may not always kind of put regulatory and data together, but if you think about it, things like inspections and process requirements and compliance things and things like that, that all requires a lot of work, and usually that involves data. And so are there ways that we can streamline or be more predictive, or whatever the case may be, to reduce that sort of non-discretionary regulatory cost of doing business? So we have found that is actually, it's not always thought of, but it can be a very ripe area for analytics. And then kind of along the lines of sponsorship and buy-in, who would be the best supporters of this? And by this, I mean, who are going to be the stakeholders and future champions that would kind of get in lockstep and support your efforts and be recipients and contributors to these analytics endeavors. Who should really own this? Okay, so this is to say which department is going to run the show and have the resources in a centralized fashion at first. Who's really gonna drive this, and which vertical do they belong in, or which corporate group do they belong in? Okay. This is a big one. Is our culture ready for this? And we don't have enough time to delve into this in any depth today. However, suffice it to say, we are really big on culture. Analytics is just as much or more a cultural endeavor than a technology endeavor. And so, have a feel for how far along is the culture in being able to adopt and embrace. And if it's not, then, what are the things that you need to do to pave the way for that? So that's another conversation, but can't underscore that enough. And then this brings us back to who should really sponsor this. So we've already harped on that, going to continue to do that. It's very important to identify those folks. So those are kind of hard fought lessons that we've had from our own previous lives, as well as talking to clients. So in self-education, this is where we've moved on from the internal assessment phase to self-education. And I'll be a little more brief with some of these from here on. But self-education is that externally focused look, right? So begin to research analytics in your industry. What are the trade journals saying? What are the industry bloggers saying? What are some of the marketing messages that you see out there in your industry with respect to analytics? And then if you have good ways of analyzing competition, be sure to include what are they doing with data, what are they doing with data science and analytics and data management and all these concepts, right? What can you learn from the competition? And then begin to scout maybe vendors and consultants that you think would be potentially helpful. And you may or may not already have contacts at these firms. We're not saying that you have to run out and meet everybody just yet, but it's a good idea to begin to screen and look for them, right? So that's the beginning. Try to understand what's going on in your industry. And those vendors may or may not be directly in your industry. Don't be afraid to look at adjacent industries or just sort of industry agnostic type providers. Then on the subject of champions, continue to educate that group. So if you're kind of the informal leader at this point, begin to convene that group and cultivate healthy dialogue. What are your perspectives? What are you learning? You just talked to that consultant. What did they say? Begin to have a common living, breathing knowledge base and try to have the beginning of this core group here, right? So that's educating champions, and that really never stops. It always keeps going. And then as a part of that, you know that you're really starting to gel as a group if you can establish common operational definitions of key terms. And man, I tell you, even before I was in data science, I observed so many meetings, and you can all relate to this, where it seemed like the entire hour was essentially wasted because people were using the same term but meaning different things, and had to meet again and again until they understood and had that revelation that they meant different things. So, the last thing you want to do is confuse the people who you're asking to approve your efforts by having sort of non-standard jargon around these terms and ideas, right? So very important, and begin to build a glossary there. And then socialize these definitions, right? That goes without saying. And then data management. So we talked about this in the previous phase of internal assessment. At this point, you will have gotten a feel for what's going on in your industry in the internal assessment or inside your company in the internal assessment. This is where you want to be looking outside. What is data lifecycle management? What does that mean to you? And we can offer our definitions, but it's important to do this for yourselves, right? What are some of the tools out there? You have all heard terms like master data management, data governance, metadata management, data lineage. There's all these things, right? And there are some big gorillas out there that claim to meet all the needs, and then there's smaller firms that kind of pick one of those areas and run with it and try to compete on that. There's quite a landscape of tools out there, and it continues to grow and expand. And so begin to familiarize with all that, and what does it mean? Data quality is another one. Okay, so that's data management. And then finally, at the beginning of this self-education, you want to start drafting an actual position paper that describes your data strategy for your organization. And you're not seeking anybody's approval yet. This is just kind of noodling on, okay, what's this going to look like? What's our real value proposition that needs to evolve to the point of actually getting approval to proceed to an investment and business case phase, right? So what's that value proposition? Also in this position paper, you kind of need to have a statement of your current capabilities, as we discussed, where we are, and kind of where we'd like to be in order to attain that value proposition. And you want to be sure to include, so the color commentary of feedback that you've gotten from sponsors and executives and champions in this position paper as well. And remember, it's a draft, okay? So it's just to start socializing the conversation. Some points of wisdom in the self-education phase. Again, we've already said this. What are you doing in your industry? But don't be afraid to look in other industries that you think might have, seemingly similar challenges or opportunities, right? And I'm sure you probably all are scouting other industries and learning from them in other areas of your business already. And then get out and talk to them, and I know that's not as easy today with the virtual world we're living in, but create relationships, use your network across industries. Maybe if you're in manufacturing, you've got buddies in healthcare, whatever the case may be. Get out there and see what you can learn with webinars and events and tech on tap type conversations, all those kinds of things. And then really, at this point, if you haven't already sort of bolstered your own sort of passionate attitudes, now's the time to really take stock and take a perspective of, okay, if we don't do this now, when will we ever do it? And to underscore that, we got plenty of quotes for you, but we'll spare you and just say, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best is today. I'm sure many of you have heard that before, but this really applies here. And then also, to make it even more fun, think about this. 10 years from now, can you possibly imagine being competitive in your industries without being good at data management and analytics? And to kind of drive this home, we have this fun graphic here. Think about all these industries that have been overturned by startups that came out of nowhere and had a plan and a data strategy, and they learned how to leverage that data. And really, the sort of data infrastructure is their main competitive advantage, right? And so, it's useful, and not trying to terrify anybody here, but it's useful to think about the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that comes into play when you think about the question, what about my industry? When will my industry be kind of turned on its head, right, by some new startup? So when you're done with self-education, you want to have this position paper, and the elements of that draft position paper are the trends in your industry, the priorities that you've heard about from executives, an assessment of capability with all these pieces that were described. And it's really critical to begin to try out statements around strategic position in terms of where we need to go, both in terms of opportunity as well as what if we don't do this, what are the ramifications? And then the other side of that coin is the value proposition, and that's kind of more of an ROI type statement. And again, we're not trying to get you to claim an actual return in raw numbers. It's more along the lines of which categories of return and, sort of maybe order of magnitude, how much better could we be, right? So this is really, you're not trying to have anybody quote you or hold you to these statements. It's really just trying them out in order to get the juices flowing to move to that next approval level. Also at this point, that ultra important position paper, you could even think of operational definitions or a glossary as maybe if your position paper is page 1, flip the page, and now you've got a simple glossary that you could hand to a C-level person describing what do these terms mean, like, data quality or data governance or AI. AI definitions abound, right? So you want to define what those kind of things mean. So when an executive says it, they're not thinking about necessarily self-driving cars, they're thinking about something that applies to them. And then also you want to have the sponsor feedback, which will have grown by this point and kind of taken more shape. So those are the things that you want to have in hand after the self-education phase. So this moves us into strategy positioning, and this is really kind of the on-ramp to moving to the next phase of getting permission to do a full-on business case with financials and getting the resources to plan out what that would look like. So it may be you or it may be someone else in your organization, but you need to select a lead person. And this is the person that once you get approval, hopefully, this person is going to be essentially full-time, leading the data strategy efforts. And it's really important here, there's different ways of promoting people in different schools of thought. In this particular case, we highly recommend having somebody that's, you don't want to pick someone that's just available and has the time. And similarly, you don't want to pick somebody that's, as a development opportunity, although I suppose that could work. You want to pick somebody that's highly respected in the organization, maybe definitely articulate, some charisma, that people are going to want to work with, and that have had some scars on their back from all the work that they've put in, and they kind of earn the street credibility, right? So it's very important to pick somebody that's going to be a great leader of this new initiative. From this point, you want to start expanding that stakeholder group as well as you lead up to your approval. And by this, we mean, so you're kind of moving beyond the champions, sponsors, and so on to really get a little more skin in the game from people in different departments or verticals that you can count on for when you launch this thing. They're going to be able to pony up people to work with you. So they're going to be the recipients of your work, but they're also going to need to contribute to defining requirements and testing things out. And, they're going to need to spend part of their time and maybe even part of their budget, working with you. Okay. And then build that external expert network a little more as well. So at this point, it's probably important that you've built some relationships, no commitments or obligations, but, looking for those vendors and consultants that maybe you've got a short list already of folks that you might want to use later on in later phases, and they can even be guiding you as you move into the investment strategy phase, right? And then, of course, you want to be in peer groups in your industry and continue all of that good dialogue with your competition if there's a way to be doing that. And then synthesize, and this is a catch-all term to mean gather everything that you've learned and use it all to refine that one-page position paper, and circulate that, get feedback again from champions and stakeholders. And that includes sponsors and maybe even executives and kind of informal pre-meetings. And it's not uncommon to kind of share that paper prior to an approval meeting with different executives to make sure you're kind of speaking their language and that they understand what you're about to present. So it's all the meetings before the meeting. And then in that conversation, if you're sensing that there's some execs or key sponsors that maybe need a little more understanding, kind of offer just that executive education to solidify their understanding so that they feel good when you have this approval discussion. And then get their feedback, of course. And that feedback now is kind of like the wisdom and recommendations on how to present your ask. And then finally, there's a lot to be said for meeting design. So you want to plan that approval approach. So who's in the meeting? How long is the meeting? What's the content? Who are the folks that you need to keep kind of your eyes on them to get that nonverbal communication? All these kind of things. And depending on the size of your organization, this could take a little longer to prepare. But you know your cultures and you'll know what works. But we can't underscore the importance of that enough, because this might not seem like a business as usual type discussion for the people who are going to approve and appropriate funds. So again, you've heard us talk about culture. You really want to frame up your meeting, your approval meeting, as something that will be an extension of your existing culture and not counter to it. And it's tempting to think of this as like a centerpiece of a digital transformation. And really, there's nothing wrong with that. But, our experience is that you want this to seem accessible and like, just your good people continuing to do good work, maybe trying out some new things rather than some huge cultural shift. Now, if you're already in the throes of a digital transformation initiative, then that's okay. Just fit what you're doing into that already. Okay. So it's really key to think about culture here. And then, of course, this probably is, goes without saying, but you want to be ready to articulate 2 or 3 really clear examples of potential projects and show without any sort of ambivalence or uncertainty that they definitely align to the corporate strategy, okay? And you may even want to have what we call hip pocket use cases in an appendix that if a particular exec has a real passion for something, you could flip to a slide later in the deck that describes that one, and have those. So you might even have as many as 6 or 8 things, presenting 1, 2, or 3 in the beginning of your presentation, and then using the others as needed to flow with the dialogue. And then, again, we've kind of mentioned this in some previous slides. Don't be shy to invoke healthy fear of doing nothing, right? You don't want to be standing still in this area, okay? And we always like to use the boiling frog analogy. Are we the boiling frog that's, in a state where we just can't jump out of the pot anymore? So that's a useful one that I always find execs can kind of relate to that. So that maybe try that on for size. And then, just to put a really fine point on it, these are the precise things that you want to get out of the meeting, and these are the precise things that you want to ask approval for. Okay, so the goals of the meeting are get executive agreement on your organization's need to have a formal data strategy, because some folks might even say, hey, we're already doing this. I don't think we've got enough strategic initiatives already. Do we really want to adopt another one? You really want to get over that potential barrier and get formal adoption of a data strategy in the form of that position paper, okay? And then again, secure durable executive sponsorship. What do I mean by durable? Okay, that's what we referred to earlier. That's got to be somebody that will continue to reinforce the behaviors and performance structures inside the organization to be sure and make this a reality and a success year in and year out over the course of budget cycles and over the course of other competing initiatives and priorities that have the potential to strip away the resources that you've asked for. So you need that sponsor or sponsors to be durable in the sense of longevity and in terms of their passion for the issue and in terms of their budgets, right? And then, of course, get approval to develop the full business case to invest in the data strategy as defined in the position paper. So at this point, you're going to have a good feel for who all needs to be pretty much full-time or a huge part of their time building this business case out. And it's probably, either you or some delegate in the organization that's going to make this essentially their full-time job. And then in terms of what precisely are you asking approval for, make this extremely explicit that you're asking for the executive folks who are in the approving position to adopt the refined position paper and get their approval to proceed to the next phase to do full business case, complete with financials and ROI claims and a plan for realizing benefits and all of that in phase 1 data strategy investment, which will be the subject of a future talk, and we hope to have you all back for that. Okay, so that's the approval meeting. So what we've walked through is the exploration phase, the exploratory phase. We call that phase 0 because it's really before you get going. It's all the homework you need to do to get approval to move. The outcome is a defined data strategy. And it also, the outcome is to get permission to move into investment. And in the investment phase, the outcome is the business case with financials and everything that I've said multiple times. And then these other phases that we've described with their respective outcomes, as you can see there. So this is really the culmination of the talk today, and really grateful for everyone's time. As you can tell, we're really super passionate about this, and we want to be helping as many of you who would like our help. Or if you just want to talk and learn more and ask that next question, well, we can do that now and in any follow-up communication as well. So very grateful for everyone's time. I really enjoyed this and putting this together. I'm excited to hear your questions. And there's my contact info. And there's going to be a few different ways to get back in touch with us if you would like as well. So that's what I've got. And Mallory, I guess it's back to you, right?
All right, so the first question we have for you, Josh, is who by titles do you typically see as champions, sponsors, and who tends to lead these efforts, coordinate an analytics effort?
Yeah, super question. So the cheesy consultant answer is it depends, of course, but I'll provide a few different scenarios. There's really no one right answer, but in our experiences, you might see champions coming out of like an operations role, somebody that really sees the value or the missing link of data management or analytics talent. So it could be like a VP of operations or an engineering director. It could also be like director of finance, or it might be somebody in IT that's been really wanting to create value. A lot of times we find that even though IT wants to be leading this, they aren't necessarily set up to do that because they've got so many other sort of day-to-day priorities. So it can range. So the champion isn't necessarily even a data scientist or a statistician. It's somebody that sees the need, sees the value, and then also has respect to their peers to be having the conversation. In terms of sponsors, that can also range. I think that, again, I tend to lean towards operations. That's my background, but it can also be finance and even the CFO. I kind of picked on the CFO earlier, but sometimes IT organizations report up to the CFO, and it's kind of that person's imperative to get that done. And then depending on how many levels of hierarchy there are in your organization, maybe it's like the head of a division or business unit or one of that person's direct reports. And then, the sponsorship can really range, but it's got to be somebody that, you have a good relationship with. Maybe you're in their vertical and can be having regular meetings on budget and all of that. So that ranges as well. If you're lucky enough to already have a chief data officer, that person could be both champion and sponsor. Or maybe that person reports to the CFO, CEO, CIO. I mean, there's a lot of different organizational structures. And then, so that was champion, sponsor, and what was the other one?
That was it.
Okay.
Who tends to lead these efforts?
Yeah, who tends to lead them? Yeah, so I hope that helps with that. And if the individual who asked that wants to follow up after, there's a lot more that could be said on all that.
Next up is, does the framework have any timeline or duration?
Well, no. And that's an interesting point because this might be a good question to sort of bring back up I think I'm doing this right, Mallory?
Yes.
Okay, I need to refresh this, don't I? That might depend on the statistics, right? And where you are. So if you're at the very beginning of this journey and you're a small organization, you can see this taking a while, right? But if you're a larger organization and you've already tried this, but maybe you've had, I don't know, let's just say some fits and starts, you might be able to build on what you've already done. So it could be that you've already got your efforts underway and you just need to kind of course correct. So I mean, in theory, I would say that our framework probably gives like an 18 to 24 month as just a high level, but don't hang your hat on that because it greatly depends on these stats that I'm showing. And so it looks like we got a lot of smaller industry folks and a lot of bigger industry folks. That's really cool. And then a pretty good number of folks answered intermediate here, which is a good place to be in. And one answered advanced. So also very interesting to see. So yeah, I would say rule of thumb, it's going to be 1.5 to 2 years because you want to give yourself time to really understand and, explore what are the options out there and what are the use cases that you want to implement. You probably are going to have at least one pilot project as part of your implementation effort. So you want to give yourself time to learn from that. That's how I'd answer that.
In your presentation, you said determine which vertical to lead the initiative under. Is the initiative better under a CIO as a technology initiative or under the business as a business-led initiative?
Great question. And so in a previous life, my colleagues and I had to contend with that. And there's pros and cons to both. And again, it really depends on your culture and your, kind of budgetary situation and everything else. But I'll give you the pros and cons. So having it in IT, the pro is that you can get access to the data and the systems, and the champion, maybe it's a director of applications or a data officer. You're going to be kind of rubbing elbows with all the right people to get the platforms underway. But the potential trick there is that if the CIO has a lot of competing priorities and other things take priority in the budget, it might be harder to get off the ground. So that's the pros and cons of that. If it's a vertical like in operations or a division or what have you, there's some really great aspects of that because that's really close to the business use cases, and that individual might have access to one of the larger budgets inside the organization, and you can build a lot of a real practical momentum, right? That doesn't necessarily have the normal trappings of IT and sort of the processes that need to be observed there. But then on the other hand, if you don't have access to the systems and data and hold the keys to the servers and things like that, you still definitely need to have IT involved, right? And it's not that they want to slow you down, it's just that they have other things going on. So it's really an important discussion. Another thing is that you could potentially incubate it inside IT and then launch it out and have that organization report up through a different vertical or C-level person later on, or it could be vice versa. So, I haven't answered the question definitively, but I'm giving you perspective on some of those options and how you might think through that.
Awesome. So we just have two more left. First is, does the Kellerstrader Data Strategy Group work with companies outside of your geographic footprint?
Absolutely. More and more. In fact, we have a client in California right now that we're helping, and we tend to align to industries in some cases that are all lower 48, and so we've actually gotten pretty good at talking to clients in a sort of a pre-sales mode as well as delivering virtually through the pandemic. So just like a lot of you, I mean, obviously the pandemic has been horrible, but we've kind of learned to adapt, and in some ways it has allowed us to be a little more loose with our geography. So we absolutely do. I even saw that there were a few international folks on the line today, so that's exciting. That could be interesting.
And then last but not least, I have found in the past that data is garbage in and garbage out. How can you define the data that can be agreed on and defined?
Okay, another super question that could be its own presentation. And so whoever asked that, love to get in touch with you. So when I was talking about data management practices and tools, there's a whole kind of emerging sort of sub-discipline around that. And so, the phrase master data management and metadata management and data governance and data quality, these are all kind of like, frankly, they're business functions where you'll want to identify people in the organization whose job it is to be responsible for data quality, okay? So certainly there's all kinds of modes and scenarios where data goes wrong, okay? And because of this emerging discipline of data management, there's a lot of a great literature and thought leadership out there on how to make that better. So essentially you have to focus on it. And a great way to think of it is data is really an asset, and you don't really see it on balance sheet per se, but some of the big internet giants, there's been a lot of study around their intangible assets are often attributed to the value of their data. And similarly, there's even, for what comes out of cybersecurity and ransomware and all this stuff, people are beginning to think of data as having a true balance sheet value on both the asset and liability side. And someday we might see that. So that was kind of long-winded, but what I'm getting at here is if you think of data as an asset that kind of has a cradle and a grave, data is generated somewhere, and then it's used to run the business, and then it might be stored somewhere to do analytics and what if analysis and used in applications aside, sort of ERPs. And then ultimately that data reaches the end of its life and it's either archived or purged or whatever. So that entire data life cycle, the better you manage that data, the better value you're going to be getting out of it. And so, I would really encourage everyone to kind of think of it in those terms because yes, garbage in, garbage out, dueling spreadsheets, finger pointing, we've all lived through a lot of that, and there's a better way. You just kind of have to roll up your sleeves and start learning on how to manage data better. So that's what I got on that one.
That was it.
Any others?
That was it.
Okay. Well, everyone, thank you so much for your time. I guess we ended in less than an hour. I'm so grateful, and be looking for communications back on the site where you signed up for the event, and stay tuned for future discussions along the roadmap that I showed earlier. The next one will be the investment phase, and that's probably even more important than the exploratory phase. In fact, we would say it is the most important part of it. So I hope you all tune back in, and appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you all.